You've probably heard a child say, "You don't understand me," and brushed it off as normal teen rebellion or childhood drama. But what if that statement wasn't defiance at all? What if it was the last signal before something inside them went quiet? Most parents don't realize that a child who feels chronically misunderstood doesn't just grow out of it, they grow inward. And by the time you notice the silence, years of emotional rewiring have already taken place. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. Have you been listening to your child or just waiting for them to stop talking? Research from developmental psychology shows that children who feel persistently misunderstood by their caregivers begin to alter their neural pathways related to trust and self-expression as early as age 7. The brain interprets chronic emotional dismissal the same way it interprets physical neglect. It creates a blueprint for relationships that says, "My feelings are a burden. My truth is inconvenient." And once that blueprint is set, it becomes the operating system for how they navigate every relationship in their life. This isn't about bad parenting. It's about a gap that grows so slowly, most families don't see it until it's become a canyon. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that gap forms, why it causes lasting damage, and what you can do to repair it before it's too late. The first thing that happens when a child feels misunderstood for years is that they stop trying to be understood. That might sound obvious, but the process is far more complex than just going quiet. At first, a child will try repeatedly to express what they're feeling. They'll tell you they're scared, sad, or angry. They'll act out or withdraw. But if the response they get is dismissal, correction, or distraction, something fundamental shifts. The child begins to internalize a belief that their inner world is either wrong or irrelevant. Neuroscience confirms this. When emotional bids for connection are repeatedly ignored, the brain reduces activity in areas related to emotional articulation. The child doesn't lose the feelings, they lose the language to communicate them. And without that language, they become strangers to themselves. What most parents call independence or maturity is often just a child who has learned that being seen is too painful to keep attempting. That's not growth, that's shutdown. This leads directly to the second pattern, which is the development of what psychologists call a false self. When a child realizes that their authentic emotions don't fit into the family system, they begin constructing a version of themselves that does. They become compliant, high-achieving, funny, or invisible, whatever role keeps the peace. And here's what's so damaging about this. The false self isn't a mask they put on occasionally. It becomes their primary identity. The real self, the one with needs and fears and contradictions, gets buried so deep that even the child forgets it exists. Studies on identity formation show that children who suppress their emotional truth during developmental years struggle significantly with self-concept in adulthood. They don't know who they are because they spent their childhood being someone else. The tragedy is that parents often reward the false self. They praise the compliant child, the one who doesn't cause problems. And in doing so, they unknowingly teach their child that love is conditional on performance. The child learns that being liked is more important than being known. And that belief doesn't just fade when they turn 18. It dictates their careers, their marriages, their entire sense of worth. The third consequence is emotional numbness. This is where things get especially misunderstood by well-meaning parents. When a child stops expressing emotion, many parents feel relief. The tantrums stop. The arguments decrease. The household feels calmer. But what looks like peace is often dissociation. The child isn't regulating their emotions. They're disconnecting from them entirely. Brain imaging studies reveal that chronic emotional suppression reduces activation in the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for processing feelings. Over time, the child loses access to their emotional range. They can't name what they feel because their brain has learned to bypass feeling altogether. What parents interpret as resilience is actually a nervous system in survival mode. And here's the part that parents need to hear. You can't selectively numb emotions. When a child shuts down sadness and anger to avoid conflict, they also lose access to joy, excitement, and connection. They become functionally depressed without meeting the clinical criteria. They go through life feeling flat, disconnected, and empty, and they have no idea why. Because no one ever taught them that feelings aren't the problem. The problem was that their feelings were treated like problems. Now, before we go further, there's something deeper happening beneath all of this that most parenting advice completely misses. And it has to do with how a child's brain interprets their own value. Stay with me because this is where everything starts to make sense. The fourth pattern is the internalization of shame. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. And when a child is repeatedly misunderstood, especially during moments of vulnerability, shame becomes their core belief. They don't just think they're misunderstood. They think they're fundamentally unlovable. Research in attachment theory shows that children form their self-concept primarily through the mirroring they receive from caregivers. If a parent consistently misinterprets or dismisses a child's emotional reality, the child concludes that something is wrong with them, not with the communication. They begin to carry a quiet, pervasive sense of defectiveness. And this shame doesn't announce itself. It hides behind perfectionism, people-pleasing, or self-sabotage. The child grows into an adult who feels like an imposter in their own life, constantly waiting to be exposed as not enough. What's particularly cruel about this is that the parents often had good intentions. They weren't trying to harm their child. They were trying to protect them, toughen them up, or teach them resilience. But the child's nervous system doesn't register intention. It registers impact. And the impact of chronic emotional misattunement is a deep, inarticulate belief that they are too much and not enough at the same time. The fifth consequence is difficulty trusting others. If the people who were supposed to understand you the most failed to do so for years, why would you trust anyone else? Children who grow up feeling misunderstood develop hypervigilance around relationships. They're constantly scanning for signs of rejection, misinterpretation, or abandonment. They either avoid intimacy altogether or they cling desperately to anyone who offers even shallow validation. Attachment research makes this clear. Early relational patterns become templates. If your first experience of being known was being misread, your brain learns that closeness is dangerous. The irony is that these children often become adults who desperately want connection, but have no idea how to build it. They've never seen what it looks like to be truly seen and still accepted. So they either settle for relationships that mirror the same misattunement they grew up with, or they isolate entirely. Both options feel safer than the vulnerability of trying to be understood again and failing. And the cycle continues, often into the next generation, unless something interrupts it. The last and perhaps most heartbreaking outcome is the loss of self-trust. When a child's internal experience is repeatedly invalidated, they stop trusting their own perceptions. They second-guess their feelings, their memories, their instincts. If a parent says, "You're not really upset," or "that didn't happen the way you remember," enough times, the child learns to doubt their own reality. This is how gaslighting works, even when it's unintentional. The child begins to rely on external validation for everything because their internal compass has been dismantled. Cognitive development research shows that children who are chronically invalidated struggle with decision-making, self-advocacy, and boundary setting well into adulthood. They don't know what they want because they were never allowed to want anything that conflicted with what their parents wanted. They don't know what they feel because their feelings were rewritten for them. And they don't know who they are because their identity was never theirs to define. This is the deepest wound of all. It's not just that they feel misunderstood by others. They feel misunderstood by themselves. So let's bring this together. A child who feels misunderstood for years doesn't just struggle with communication. They struggle with identity, connection, and self-worth. They shut down emotionally. They construct false selves to survive. They internalize shame. They lose trust in others and in themselves. And all of this happens quietly, beneath the surface, while parents assume everything is fine because the child stopped complaining. The real tragedy is that most of this is preventable. It doesn't require perfect parenting, it requires presence. It requires the humility to admit when you've misread your child and the courage to repair the rupture instead of pretending it didn't happen. It requires asking, "Help me understand," instead of insisting, "I already know. Here's what I want you to think about." If you could go back to one moment where your child tried to tell you something and you missed it, what would you do differently? Drop your answer in the comments because I read every one and I want to hear your story. If this video helped you see something you couldn't see before, subscribe to Mind Grooming. This channel exists to help parents understand the psychology behind what their kids actually need, not just what they say they need. And if you know another parent who's struggling to connect with their child, share this video. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is help someone else see their blind spots. In the next video, we're going to talk about how to rebuild trust with a child who's already shut down, even if years have passed, because it's never too late to start listening. It's just harder when the silence has already learned to speak louder than words.